besides the fact that we literally jail more people on this planet than in any other country, what makes incarceration in the United States so unique? Jandarka, I'll turn to you with that.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question. And I think something that there's a lot of conversations about it. So it's amazing that that's also happening. And I think that's also a result of the rebellion. People are way more interested now in talking about incarceration, police violence. So mass incarceration is usually the term that's given to define this experiment that American institutions embarked on starting in the 1970s that led to an exponential increase in the number of people who are jailed and incarcerated in jails and prisons in the United States. And there's like all these charts you could look up online, but it seems that the U.S. imprisonment rate was relatively steady up until the 1970s and 1980s. And then we see this huge jump of, up to the upwards of over 200%, 300%, 400%. So mass incarceration usually refers to this and also refers to the stark racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Again, when we look at African Americans' incarceration rate is oftentimes 5 times or 6 times that of whites. Latinos is about 3 to 4 times of whites. So we also see a system that's very disproportionately racialized, right? However, something that Jared and I are really clear about, and this is, again, we're not unique. Part of writing this book and thinking about this has been in conversation with other scholars, other activists who are also saying this, is that the focus on mass incarceration alone does not take into account the ways in which the criminal justice system has become one of the main ways in which people experience the state today, right? That it goes beyond jails and prisons. It goes to the most quotidian police encounter, the traffic stop, right? It also expands to probation and parole. So it's really kind of an expansive system of various institutions that seek to stigmatize, surveil, and punish the poor in America.
Right. And I mean, it's all your focus as well on it, and I'll turn to Jared here, on it being a system of class domination, that also manifests itself in those kind of along those racially stratified lines, is a really important emphasis. And you also highlight how for the working class in this country, there's kind of a unified shared experience for many people where their interactions with the state have been kind of reserved for the carceral system. What does that do to an entire section of the country when that is the dominant form of interaction?
I'm glad you brought up the overlapping experiences of race and class that characterize how the punishment system is lived. I think it's really important to emphasize that any political framework that forces you to choose between race or class is just a complete analytical dead end. We tried our best to reconstruct how the carceral state throughout history has functioned as an explicit tool of class domination. And I think it's really interesting to note here that the prison and other related disciplinary technologies that currently dominate American life were not developed in response to unfree labor in the American South during slavery. They were developed as disciplinary tools for free labor in Western Europe in the early days of capitalism. On the flip side of that, however, the particular racial division of labor in the United States has worked and developed in tandem with the growth of mass incarceration to produce a distinctly racialized form of class domination. And so, unfortunately, the reconciliation of race and class in this analysis does not fit on a bumper sticker, right? It doesn't make for a great slogan just quite yet. But I think we tried our best to understand race as a process that's constantly being created and recreated within class society at the same time as the punishment system and other modes of class domination are developing and evolving, right? And so what this means in terms of possibilities for solidarity across the lines of race that American society is organized along, right, is that there are a whole lot of white people who actually experience the carceral state in an extremely negative way. At the same time, we need to be attuned to the very particular experience of African Americans in particular, who constitute such a disproportionate number of the punishment system's victims.
Yeah, Jandarka, Jandarka. I apologize. Yeah, I got tongue-tied for a sec. Can you expand on that point there about it being a system for free labor? Because I feel like there's people don't fully understand that those systems very much do remain. That there are many prisons and jails in this country that still essentially exploit their prison population even further for their labor. And I think that that's a great example of how intrinsically tied this is to capitalism.
Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate you asking that. And I think, so I want to say a couple of things. And we take a lot of time in the book to give a very accessible account of how can we think about crime and punishment, race and class in relationship to capitalism. And, and again, it's building on the work of a lot of scholars and activists, but we really want it to be in an accessible way, in a way to offer also folks that have been politicized by the last decade of struggles, continuous political language by which to talk about this, right? So I think it's a mistake in many ways to see mass incarceration, while it's well-intentioned, right? To see it as like, after the 70s, man, like everything just went wrong. But actually the history of punishment, historically has been really important for capitalism, right? So we take some time to talk about how crime, right? Even like Marx and Engels talked about this, right? Was an important way to form, punishment was kind of a reaction to crime, but it was a way to force working people to accept really crappy jobs, right? Because the alternative was a jail and a prison cell, right? So it's no coincidence that even today we see the criminalization of everyday life, from, let's say, loitering to homelessness to any kind of non-wage work, right? So criminalization and punishment have a long history in its uses by capitalism, right? By the state. The ways in which, for instance, a lot of times the liberal democracies give this illusion that the law is transparent, is equal, right? That the police are there to protect people. So I think we really need to kind of be critical of that and denaturalize a lot of those categories. But I think, kind of to bring it back to the current moment, it's historical, right? So it's not just about this present moment, but there's a way in which I think if you watch documentaries like 13th, which I really love, right? It's a great introduction to this topic. You get away feeling like there's private prisons in the United States, right? That the problem is private corporations, and the problem is that prisoners are being used for their labor, right? And they're not being paid for it. So the reality is that only 12% of American prisons are privatized. Most people who sit in jails and prisons across America are not doing much work. They're sitting there. They're literally being warehoused in some ways. They're being quarantined, right, from the rest of society. So I think we need to have more nuanced understandings of how it is that criminalization and punishment work. The last thing I'll say, especially in an era where so many people after the 70s have been thrown out of the labor market, right? Where the kind of jobs that people had in the past no longer exist, right? And mass incarceration, in many ways, we argue, as others have, is really a response to this crisis of capitalism, this crisis of work, this crisis of deindustrialization, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a really necessary reframing there, because there is sometimes like this liberal tendency to tweak exploitative systems as a way to make them, like, say, smarter, or smart policing, right? Which is actually what we just saw. That Scorpion unit was a highly targeted crime unit, and there are a bunch of different impulses that just dance around necessary, more radical changes there. And the focus, honestly, on private prisons as opposed to the system of imprisonment is one of those.